December 1944. The air above the Ardennes was thick with snow, smoke, and the echo of tank engines rumbling through the forest. For the German army, it was supposed to be their last chance. A desperate counterattack to turn the tide of World War II. They called it Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, the Battle of the Bulge, but as their armored spearheads pushed into Belgium, one thing mattered more than bullets or bravery of fuel. Without it, even the most powerful tanks became nothing more than steel coffins. Amid that chaos rode Major Friedrich Koch, commander of a German logistics unit, tasked with one impossible mission: to find and capture Allied fuel. And somehow, against all odds, he did. Near the small Belgian town of Stavelot, his men stumbled upon an abandoned American depot. Inside were rows upon rows of fuel drums. Over 50,000 gallons of the lifeblood Germany's panzers desperately needed. It was a miracle, or so it seemed. The men cheered. For the first time in weeks, they believed victory might still be possible. But when Major Koch looked closer, he saw something that froze his blood. The depot wasn't unguarded. Something was terribly wrong. What unfolded next would reveal the truth, that even 50,000 gallons of captured fuel couldn't save a dying army. What he saw in those next moments shattered the illusion of hope and marked the beginning of the end for Hitler's final gamble in the West. This is the untold story of how one German officer's discovery exposed the fatal weakness of the Third Reich, and how the dream of victory in the Ardennes went up in flames. By late 1944, the German war machine was running on fumes, literally. The once invincible Wehrmacht, which had rolled across Europe in a storm of steel and fire, was now crumbling. The Eastern Front was collapsing under the relentless advance of the Red Army, and in the West, the Allied forces had pushed deep into France and Belgium after the Normandy landings. Bombers from the United States and Britain darkened the skies above the Reich, reducing factories, railways, and fuel refineries to twisted metal. For every German tank still in the field, there were 10 Allied tanks waiting to crush it. But Hitler refused to accept defeat. In his mind, there was still one last chance, one final strike that could break the Allies' resolve and turn the tide of the war. That plan became known as the Ardennes Offensive, or as the Allies would call it, the Battle of the Bulge. The idea was audacious, even insane. Hitler believed that by striking through the Ardennes forest, the same route Germany had taken in 1940, he could surprise the Allies once more. If his armies could break through the thinly held American lines and reach Antwerp, the vital Allied supply port, they could split the British and American forces in half. The Western Allies, he hoped, would lose heart and seek peace, giving Germany a chance to focus its strength against the Soviets in the East. The plan's success, however, depended on one thing above all else: fuel. Without it, even the most powerful tank in the world was nothing more than a useless pile of iron. By December, fuel had become the lifeblood of the German army, and there wasn't enough of it to go around. The Luftwaffe's planes often couldn't even take off for lack of aviation fuel. Entire divisions were left idle because their trucks and tanks were empty. Hitler's generals warned him that launching such an offensive without secure fuel reserves was suicidal. But Hitler, obsessed with the idea of a miracle in the West, brushed aside their concerns. "We will capture what we need from the Americans," he declared confidently. "Their supply lines are long, their depots are full. We will drive our tanks on their fuel." So the orders went out. Every tank crew, every armored column, every logistics officer was told to find and seize Allied fuel dumps at all costs. German soldiers carried fuel hoses, siphons, and empty jerry cans alongside their rifles. Fuel convoys were assigned to follow closely behind the spearheads, ready to collect whatever the Americans left behind. The plan depended on speed and deception. If the Germans could strike fast enough, they might catch the Allies off guard before reinforcements could arrive. But every commander knew the danger. One delay, one unexpected setback, and the entire offensive could grind to a halt. Among those tasked with this impossible mission was Major Friedrich Koch, a 38-year-old logistics officer from the Ruhr region. He had joined the Wehrmacht as a young man in the 1930s, back when Germany's rearmament still carried the thrill of destiny and pride. But by 1944, Koch was no idealist. He had seen the front lines, The burning villages in Russia, the frozen corpses outside Leningrad, the endless funerals. He knew what war really was. His unit wasn't made up of elite SS men or panzer crews. They were mechanics, truck drivers, and engineers, responsible for keeping the steel beasts of war alive. Yet in this campaign their role was crucial. Without them, the tanks of the 6th Panzer Army couldn't move. On December 16, 1944, the offensive began. Before dawn, the German artillery unleashed a thunderous barrage on the American positions in the Ardennes. Thousands of shells lit up the forest like lightning. Then came the tanks, Panthers, Tigers, and King Tigers, rolling out of the mist, their engines roaring like monsters awakened from hibernation. American troops, caught off guard, fell back in confusion. Roads jammed with retreating convoys and burning trucks. To many German soldiers, it felt like 1940 all over again. A stunning breakthrough, the enemy in disarray. For Major Friedrich Koch, the chaos was both an opportunity and a nightmare. His orders were clear: secure captured American fuel at all costs and deliver it to the advancing tank columns. Without it, the offensive would stall before it even began. As the first reports of breakthroughs filtered in from the front, Koch and his convoy of fuel trucks moved in behind the spearhead of Kampfgruppe Peiper, one of the most feared and aggressive SS formations in the entire German army. Led by Joachim Peiper, the young and ruthless Waffen-SS officer, this armored group was cutting deep into American lines, burning through fuel faster than they could capture it. The roads through the Ardennes were narrow and treacherous, choked with snow and mud. Dead branches cracked under the treads of tanks, and the constant rumble of engines echoed through the fog. The forest felt alive with movement, flashes of headlights, shouts in German and English, the crack of distant gunfire. Major Koch's men were not frontline fighters, but in the chaos of this offensive there was no safe rear. Every truck carried a precious cargo, and every kilometer forward risked ambush or bombardment. Then, on December 18th, near the small Belgian town of Stavelot, Koch's luck seemed to change. Peiper's units had overrun an American fuel depot, more than 50,000 gallons of gasoline sitting in massive drums and tankers, abandoned in the rush to retreat. When Koch arrived on the scene, he could hardly believe his eyes. The depot was half hidden behind a cluster of pine trees, a scattering of supply tents and maintenance sheds still smoldering from the bombardment. German soldiers were already swarming the site, shouting, laughing, and cheering. For a brief electric moment, it felt like the impossible had happened. They had captured the very lifeblood of the enemy's war machine. Koch climbed down from his truck, the cold wind biting his face. He watched as soldiers rolled barrels onto transport vehicles, their breath steaming in the air. "Major!" one of his lieutenants called out, pointing toward the fuel readings. 50,000 gallons, sir. Enough to keep the armor moving for days. Koch nodded, but inside unease crept through him. The scene was almost too perfect. The barrels were intact, untouched, almost inviting. And in this war, nothing came easy. Still, he gave the order to begin refueling operations. Crews worked quickly, attaching hoses, checking seals, loading drums onto flatbeds. The smell of gasoline filled the air, sharp, intoxicating, and dangerous. As the men worked, Koch took a moment to scan the horizon. The sky was the color of lead, the trees motionless, their branches heavy with frost. The eerie quiet between artillery strikes always felt like a bad omen. He thought of Peiper's tanks, only a few kilometers ahead, advancing toward Stoumont. Every minute they delayed could be fatal. If the Americans regrouped, or if the skies cleared enough for Allied aircraft to return, the entire offensive would crumble. The Luftwaffe was grounded, low on fuel and ammunition. The German army's only hope was to strike fast and keep moving. Koch turned back to his men, shouting, "Get it loaded. Every drop counts." By nightfall, the first convoy of refueled vehicles was ready to depart. But then one of the drivers, a young corporal named Franz, barely 20, ran toward him, face pale, holding up a gloved hand that smelled of fuel. "Herr Major," he stammered, "the color—" "It's not right." Koch frowned. He followed the man back to one of the drums and pried open the lid. The liquid inside shimmered faintly, not the golden hue of high-octane fuel, but a dull, cloudy amber. He dipped a stick into it, brought it close to his nose. The scent was strange, off, almost sour. A memory flashed through his mind. a training exercise months before when engineers had warned about American sabotage techniques. "Get back!" He barked suddenly, waving his arms. "Don't load any more. Check the barrels." The men hesitated, confused. Then, somewhere in the distance, a shot rang out. The crack of a sniper rifle, then the rattle of machine gun fire. The forest erupted with chaos. Tracer rounds streaked through the dark, illuminating the rows of fuel barrels like lanterns in a death trap. "It's a setup," someone yelled. Koch dropped to the ground as an explosion tore through the depot. One of the tankers ignited, sending a column of fire hundreds of feet into the air. The shockwave threw men and vehicles aside like toys. When Koch came to, his ears were ringing. The depot was an inferno. Trucks burned, men screamed, and in the distance American artillery began to thunder. It was clear now. The Americans hadn't fled in panic. They'd left the depot as bait, loaded with contaminated fuel and wired for demolition. Piper's armored spearhead, already stretched thin, would soon be cut off. What had begun as a triumph had become a trap. Koch stumbled through the smoke, coughing, his uniform torn. He watched as his men tried desperately to douse the flames, to salvage what they could. But it was hopeless. The captured fuel that could have powered the German advance was gone, consumed in an inferno that lit up the forest for miles. The smell of burning fuel mixed with the stench of scorched flesh and rubber, a scent that would never leave his memory. That night, as the remnants of his convoy limped back toward the shattered German lines, Koch realized the truth. The offensive was doomed. Without fuel, even the mightiest tanks would be stranded, sitting ducks for Allied aircraft. The men of the Wehrmacht had fought with skill and courage, but they could not fight against empty fuel tanks. And as snow began to fall over the smoldering ruins of Stavelot, Major Friedrich Koch knew that Germany's last gamble in the West had just gone up in flames, literally. The inferno at Stavelot was more than just a tactical loss. It was a symbol of everything that had gone wrong for Germany's war effort. By dawn the next morning, the once proud fuel depot had been reduced to a smoking crater, a graveyard of twisted trucks and melted steel. Major Friedrich Koch stood on the ridge above, his face smeared with soot and exhaustion, watching as the flames continued to lick the sky. His men moved quietly among the wreckage, pulling bodies from the blackened snow. The wind carried the smell of fuel and death, an acrid reminder that Germany's last great hope was dying with every barrel that burned. Reports began to pour in from the front. Piper's tanks had advanced as far as Stoumont, but were now bogged down. Fuel was running dangerously low, and the promised reinforcements were delayed by clogged roads and constant ambushes. The Americans, once caught off guard, were rallying with terrifying speed. Their artillery pounded every road and junction. Fighter bombers, taking advantage of a brief break in the weather, screamed through the clouds to rain fire on the German columns. The mighty armored spearhead that had terrified the Allies only days before was now crawling at a snail's pace, its tanks sputtering and dying one by one. Koch knew what that meant. Without fuel, every tank was a target. Every movement became an act of desperation. He ordered his surviving men to salvage what they could, anything that still held fuel, even if it meant scraping the dregs from wrecked trucks or siphoning from destroyed vehicles. They worked through the day and into the freezing night, surrounded by the echoes of distant explosions. The ground trembled beneath them with each artillery strike. Every sound, every shadow carried the threat of another attack. By the second night, the truth was impossible to ignore. The offensive had stalled. The German lines were stretched thin and vulnerable. Allied resistance was hardening everywhere. Yet in Hitler's headquarters back in Berlin, orders still came down demanding the impossible. The Führer refused to acknowledge failure. He demanded that the offensive continue, that Antwerp must still be reached, that victory was within grasp. But for the men on the ground, it was already over. Koch's convoy received a desperate request from Piper's staff. The tanks ahead were completely out of fuel, stranded near the small Belgian village of La Glaise. They needed every drop the logistics crews could deliver. Without hesitation, Koch gathered his surviving vehicles, what few still had working engines, and set off toward La Glaise. Snow fell thick and heavy, muting the world into silence. The convoy moved like ghosts through the forest, headlights covered, the only sound the slow crunch of tires over frozen mud. Along the way, they passed the wreckage of the offensive's earlier glory. Burned-out Panthers lined the roadsides, their turrets twisted by direct hits. Abandoned half-tracks were frozen in place, their occupants long gone. In one ditch lay a Tiger tank, its massive gun still aimed defiantly toward the west, its crew frozen inside. To Koch, these sights were more than just the remnants of battle. They were the last monuments of a dream that had died. When they reached La Glaise, it was chaos. The village was half destroyed, its streets littered with rubble, overturned vehicles, and the corpses of men from both sides. Piper's surviving troops had dug in among the ruins, surrounded by American forces closing in from all directions. Tanks that still had fuel guarded the outskirts, firing blindly into the darkness. The rest were immobile, hulking fortresses that could neither advance nor retreat. Kirk arrived at Piper's command post, a shattered farmhouse with sandbags piled against the windows. Inside, the young SS officer was pacing, his face pale with fury. "You brought fuel?" Piper demanded the moment Koch entered. "Some," Koch replied quietly. "Not enough. The depot was destroyed. The rest is gone." Piper slammed his fist against the table. "Then the offensive is finished," he growled. His eyes darted toward the map spread across the table, the arrows and lines that now meant nothing. "Do you understand what this means, Major? We were hours away from breaking through to the Meuse." Koch didn't respond. He didn't need to. The silence between them said everything. The offensive was collapsing, and they both knew it. Outside, another shell exploded, shaking the farmhouse. Dust rained from the ceiling. For the next 2 days, Koch stayed in La Glaise, overseeing what was left of his logistical operation. He watched as German soldiers, many barely more than boys, tried to defend positions with dwindling ammunition and freezing hands. Some were so desperate for warmth, they burned wooden furniture and even parts of destroyed vehicles. The once proud panzer divisions were now fighting like cornered animals. The enemy was closing in, their artillery constant, their infantry advancing relentlessly through the snow. On the 3rd day, the order came to withdraw. But by then it was too late. The roads were cut off, the tanks immobile. Piper gathered his officers in the dim candlelight and made the grim decision: what couldn't move would be destroyed. Koch stood among them as the order was carried out. He watched in silence as German engineers placed charges inside their tanks, lighting fuses that would erase the last remnants of their power. One by one, the Panthers and Tigers that had once terrorized Europe exploded, their fires rising into the cold night sky. When the withdrawal began, Koch led a small group of survivors on foot through the forest. They carried only what they could: rifles, blankets, and a few cans of fuel for warmth. They moved silently through the snow, guided by the faint glow of distant fires. Behind them, La Glaise burned. Ahead lay uncertainty, defeat, and the long retreat back into Germany. As they trudged through the frozen wilderness, Koch thought about the irony of it all. They had captured 50,000 gallons of fuel, enough to power their advance and perhaps change the course of battle. But in the end, it had destroyed them. The same fuel that had once driven Germany's war machine had become its undoing. It was not Allied firepower alone that had broken them, but their own desperation, their blind faith in a plan that had no chance of success. When dawn broke, the men rested among the trees. Koch looked out toward the west, where the faint rumble of American artillery echoed through the distance. The rising sun painted the snow in shades of silver and gray. He realized then that the war was no longer about victory. It was about survival. The dream of the Reich had burned away, just like the fuel at Stavelot, leaving nothing but ashes in its place. By the time Major Friedrich Koch and his exhausted men stumbled out of the forests east of La Glaise, the once grand Ardennes offensive had become a nightmare of mud, ice, and broken machinery. The snow that had blanketed the landscape in December was now a dirty, blood-stained slush. The mighty German war machine, once feared across Europe, was now limping home, its engines dead, its spirit shattered. Koch's convoy had dwindled to a handful of vehicles, all nearly out of fuel. Every road was littered with the ruins of war, burned-out trucks, abandoned tanks, and the bodies of soldiers frozen in grotesque poses of surrender or defiance. As they moved deeper into the woods, the sound of artillery grew faint. The Americans had not yet pursued this far, focused instead on tightening their grip around the trapped remnants of Piper's column. For the first time in days, there was silence. an eerie, almost unnatural quiet broken only by the crunch of boots on snow and the occasional cough of an exhausted man. Koch looked around at his soldiers. Many were barely standing. Their faces were hollow, eyes sunken, uniforms torn and stiff with frost. Some carried fuel cans slung over their shoulders, empty now but symbolic of the mission that had failed. The major stopped beside a fallen tree and motioned for a halt. He sank onto the snow, unbuttoned his coat and pulled out his canteen. The water inside was half frozen. He took a sip and passed it to the man beside him, a young corporal from Dresden, whose fingers were black with frostbite. The soldier's hands trembled as he drank. Koch didn't have the heart to tell him that he would likely lose both. The war had long since moved beyond talk of victory or honor. Now it was about who could survive another day in this endless frozen wasteland. That night, they built a small fire deep in a ravine, hidden from the air. The orange glow reflected off the snow, casting shadows that danced like ghosts around them. Some men tried to sleep, wrapping themselves in blankets stiff with ice. Others simply stared into the flames, silent and hollow-eyed. Koch sat apart from them, staring at the sky. The clouds had parted, revealing a scatter of stars. He could almost pretend for a moment that he was back home in Bavaria before the war, when the world had made sense. But the illusion shattered quickly. One of his men approached, a sergeant named Weber. "Herr Major," he said softly, "there are rumors. The Americans. They're closing in from the south. We can't stay here." Koch nodded slowly. He had heard the same reports. Small American patrols were combing the forests, searching for stragglers. Any German soldier found behind the lines was either captured or killed on sight. The major knew that if they stayed, they would be trapped. They had to move east, back toward the German border. But that meant crossing miles of snow-covered hills and enemy-infested roads, with no transport, no food, and no guarantee of survival. At dawn, they set out again. The cold was biting, the wind sharp as knives. The men wrapped scarves over their faces, but it did little to keep the frost from their skin. As they trudged through the snow, they came upon a small farmhouse, its roof half collapsed from shellfire. Koch sent 2 men to check it. Inside, they found a Belgian family huddled in the corner, an old man, a woman, and a child. Their eyes were wide with fear as the Germans entered. Koch raised his hands to show he meant no harm. He offered them his last tin of rations, a gesture of humanity in a world that had forgotten the meaning of mercy. The woman accepted it silently, tears streaking her soot-stained face. Koch's men looked on in silence. For years they had been told they were liberators, then conquerors, then defenders. Now they were just survivors, lost men trying to find their way home through a land that hated them. By midday the sun had disappeared again, swallowed by grey clouds. Snow began to fall heavy and relentless. Visibility dropped to a few meters. The men pressed on, following the faint outline of a trail through the forest. Then, without warning, machine gun fire shattered the silence. Bullets tore through the trees, kicking up bursts of snow. Koch dove behind a log, shouting for his men to take cover. The Americans had found them. For 10 minutes the forest became chaos, shouts, gunfire, the screams of the wounded. Koch returned fire with his rifle, picking out flashes of movement through the trees. But they were outnumbered and outgunned. One by one his men fell. When the shooting finally stopped, the forest was silent again, save for the moans of the dying. Koch crawled through the snow to where Weber lay bleeding. A bullet lodged in his shoulder. The sergeant's breath came in shallow gasps. "Go, leave me," he whispered. Koch shook his head and pulled him up, supporting his weight as they stumbled deeper into the woods. Hours passed before they stopped again. The snow had covered the traces of battle, erasing everything as if the forest itself wished to forget. Koch and the few survivors built a small fire and tended to the wounded. They had no morphine left, no bandages, only scraps of cloth torn from their own uniforms. Weber drifted in and out of consciousness, whispering about home, about his wife and daughter in Dresden. Koch listened silently, his own thoughts drifting to his family. He hadn't heard from them in months. He didn't know if they were alive, or if there was even a home to return to. As darkness fell, the major stared into the fire again. He thought about the war, how it had begun with triumph and glory and how it was ending now in snow and silence. He thought of the 50,000 gallons of fuel they had fought so hard to capture, only to see it destroyed in a single night of fire. It was a cruel irony, They had been sent to secure the lifeblood of Germany's final offensive, but in doing so, they had sealed their own fate. When morning came, Koch gathered his remaining men. Only 8 were left. They would continue east, he said, until they reached German lines or died trying. The men nodded without protest. They no longer marched for victory or ideology. They marched simply because they had nothing else left. As they moved off into the grey dawn, the snow swallowed their footprints behind them, erasing all trace that they had ever been there. For Koch, that endless march through the Ardennes became a symbol of everything the war had become: futile, bitter, and hollow. The grand dreams of conquest had turned to ash. The Reich was crumbling, and all that remained were men trudging through snow, haunted by the ghosts of what once was. And though he didn't know it yet, the road ahead would only grow darker, leading not to salvation but to the ruins of a nation that had already destroyed itself. The wreckage of the Ardennes offensive stretched across the Belgian countryside like a scar carved by madness. By January 1945, the once proud German war effort had collapsed into fragments. What remained of Kampfgruppe Peiper, once a spearhead of elite Waffen-SS power, was now little more than a scattering of freezing, exhausted men limping east through snow and smoke. Among them was Major Friedrich Koch, his eyes hollow, his thoughts consumed by one haunting realization. Germany's final gamble had failed. They had captured thousands of gallons of precious American fuel, 50,000 by official count, enough to keep their tanks roaring for days. But it had all been for nothing. Allied airstrikes, broken supply lines, and relentless counterattacks had made transport impossible. The fuel lay abandoned in burning depots, wasted to the wind as the Americans pressed forward once more. It was not the firepower that had broken the German war machine. It was the slow, inevitable suffocation of its fuel supply. Koch's unit, now reduced to a handful of men, trudged eastward through the snow. The countryside was in ruins. Entire villages lay blackened and hollow, their inhabitants long gone or hiding in fear. Dead horses littered the roads, their carcasses stiff under the frost. Once these same roads had carried columns of German armor, bound for victory. Now they carried nothing but ghosts. Every field seemed to whisper of defeat. As they moved, the men began to argue in hushed voices. Some still clung to the delusion that Hitler had a secret weapon, something that would turn the tide again as in 1940. Others, like Koch, no longer believed. The war had taken too much, not just from Germany but from their own souls. Koch had seen too many young soldiers die screaming in the snow, too many promises of victory or death dissolve into silence. That night, they found shelter in the ruins of a small stone church. The roof was gone, and snow drifted across the altar. A broken crucifix hung sideways on the wall, half buried in ice. The men lit a fire in the nave, the flickering light dancing across the stained glass windows shattered by shell fire. No one spoke for a long time. The silence of the church pressed down on them like the weight of history itself. Finally, one of the younger soldiers, a boy named Adler, broke the quiet. "Herr Major," he said softly, "do you think we'll make it home?" Koch looked at him, studying the pale, dirt-smeared face, the trembling hands clutching a rifle that hadn't been fired in days. "Home," Koch said almost to himself. "If there is one left." The boy lowered his head. No one had the heart to answer. The next morning, a low, droning hum rolled over the horizon. Koch stepped outside and looked up. A formation of American bombers was crossing overhead, their bellies gleaming in the winter sun. They weren't even flying low. There was no German air force left to challenge them. He watched the bombers pass, knowing that somewhere east another city was about to burn. The sound filled him not with anger, but with a deep, hollow resignation. Germany was finished. Everyone could feel it. Later that day, they encountered a German logistics officer driving a lone truck along the icy road. The man stopped when he saw Koch's group, half-starved soldiers dragging their rifles through the snow. "You're heading the wrong way," the officer shouted. "The front's collapsing. The Americans are already past Stavelot." Koch walked up to him. "Where are you going?" he asked. The officer hesitated. "Back to Germany. Orders are to regroup east of the Rhine." Koch looked inside the truck. It was loaded with fuel drums, American ones captured days earlier. "And those?" he asked. The officer smirked bitterly. "Orders say we're to deliver them to Cologne." but we don't even have tanks left to use them." Koch stared at the barrels for a long moment. That fuel, the same kind they had risked their lives to seize, was now being driven pointlessly toward a burning homeland. It was as if the entire war had become a cruel parody of itself. He stepped back from the truck, his breath misting in the air. "Keep going," he said finally. "But you won't make it." The officer nodded grimly and drove on, the truck rumbling into the distance. The fumes from the fuel lingered in the air, sharp, oily, and strangely symbolic. It was the smell of power, of fire, of everything Germany had gambled and lost. As night fell again, the snow began to come down heavier. Kirk and his men took refuge in an abandoned farmhouse. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, and the fire they built barely held back the cold. One by one, the men drifted into restless sleep. Koch sat awake, staring into the flames. He thought about the young men he had led, the ones now lying buried under the snow. He thought about the families who would never know what had happened to their sons. And he thought about the senselessness of it all, how a war that had promised greatness had brought only ruin. In the early hours before dawn, he heard footsteps crunching outside. He grabbed his rifle and moved to the window. Through the swirling snow, he saw a group of figures approaching, American soldiers, cautious and alert. Koch could have opened fire. He could have fought to the last as the Führer demanded. But instead he lowered his weapon. He turned to his men and whispered, "It's over." When the Americans entered the farmhouse, they found no resistance. Koch stood in the doorway, hands raised, his uniform filthy and torn. The American lieutenant who accepted his surrender looked at him with something like pity. "You fought well," the lieutenant said quietly. "But it's done," Koch nodded. He had no words left. As they were led away under guard, Koch looked back one last time at the fuel drums still sitting by the barn. Snow had begun to cover them again, erasing their markings, erasing everything. In that moment, he understood the cruel irony of the war he had fought, the fuel they had captured, the battles they had waged, the lives they had thrown away. All of it had been meaningless. For Germany, the war had not been lost in one great battle, but in 1,000 small defeats like this, in wasted fuel, broken promises, and men freezing in the snow for causes that no longer mattered. As the convoy of prisoners moved east toward captivity, the first light of morning broke through the clouds. It cast a pale glow over the frozen fields, over the burned-out tanks and shattered forests. The war was ending. And for Major Friedrich Koch, that realization brought not relief but emptiness, a hollow space where faith, duty, and hope had once lived. All that remained now was silence, and the long road home through a country that no longer existed. When the sun finally rose over the snowbound fields of Belgium, its light fell on a broken army. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's desperate gamble to split the Allied lines, was over. The dream of a counter-strike that could force peace on Germany's terms had died in the snow. And with it, the illusion that the Reich could still win. But for men like Major Friedrich Koch, the true end of the war wasn't marked by a date or an order. It came in small, shattering moments, moments that stripped away every illusion of purpose, every trace of pride until only truth remained. Koch and his men were now prisoners, marching west under American guard. The Americans treated them with a strange mix of professionalism and pity. They were young, many not much older than Koch's own son, with clean uniforms and full bellies. Their faces showed fatigue but not despair. To the Germans, the contrast was unbearable. Koch's soldiers, filthy, frostbitten and starving, trudged through the snow in silence. Their boots were worn to rags, their eyes dull and hollow. For years, they had believed they were invincible. Now they were just survivors of a lost cause. As they passed through small towns recently liberated by Allied troops, the civilians stared at them from behind broken windows. Some spat on the ground as the prisoners went by. Others simply looked away. The once feared Wehrmacht, which had marched into France as conquerors, was now nothing more than a column of ghosts retreating into history. Koch didn't blame the civilians for their hatred. He felt it himself. Not toward them, but toward the system that had led them all to ruin. At one stop, the American lieutenant who had accepted Koch's surrender offered him a cigarette. Koch hesitated, then accepted. The two men stood side by side, watching the column of prisoners shuffle past. "You were good soldiers," the lieutenant said quietly. "Too good, maybe." Coke exhaled slowly, the smoke curling into the icy air. "Good soldiers fight for something," he replied. "We fought because we were told to." The lieutenant didn't answer. He just nodded, perhaps understanding more than words could express. That brief exchange stayed with Coke long after the march resumed. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to think beyond orders, beyond victory and defeat, and to wonder what it all had been for. As they moved farther west, the landscape began to change. The destruction lessened, the villages grew larger, and American trucks thundered past carrying supplies, fuel, food, ammunition, everything the Germans now lacked. Coke could see with bitter clarity how completely the Allies had mastered the logistics of modern war. He had studied it as a soldier, admired it even, but seeing it now filled him with awe and sorrow. Where the German army had been stretched thin, living off desperation, the Americans seemed limitless. One day, as the prisoners were led past a massive Allied fuel depot, Coke stopped in his tracks. Row after row of fuel drums stretched as far as he could see, neatly stacked, guarded, labeled with precision. The markings on them were identical to those he had seen weeks earlier, when his men had captured their own cache of American fuel. That sight, thousands of gallons of gasoline under Allied control, hit him harder than any bomb. It was proof that Germany's war had been over long before Berlin would fall. The Reich hadn't just lost its armies. It had lost its lifeblood. He turned to the man next to him, an old sergeant who had fought since Poland. 50,000 gallons, Coke whispered. "That's what we took. 50,000 gallons to win a war that was already lost." The sergeant said nothing. He didn't have to. Both men understood. The irony was cruel. They had fought like lions to seize what the Americans had in endless supply. The very fuel that once symbolized hope for the German army was now a monument to its futility. That night they camped in a makeshift POW enclosure, little more than barbed wire in the middle of a field. The men huddled together for warmth, using their tattered coats as blankets. Coke sat alone, staring at the flicker of American campfires in the distance. They glowed steady and strong, fed by endless resources while his men's fires sputtered out one by one. It reminded him of something his old commanding officer had once said. "Wars aren't won by courage alone. They're won by fuel, food, and faith." Now, as he watched the Americans' steady flames, Coke realized Germany had run out of all three. In the following days, the prisoners were processed, names recorded, ranks noted, weapons confiscated. Some officers still carried themselves with rigid formality, clinging to the fragments of old pride. But most were like Coke, silent, weary, and broken in ways that uniforms could not hide. Letters from home began to arrive, smuggled through Red Cross channels. They spoke of bombed-out cities, of hunger, of families scattered and starving. Every word was another wound. Coke received one letter from his wife dated weeks before his capture. She wrote that their home in Düsseldorf had been destroyed, that she and their son were living with relatives near Kassel. She ended the letter with a simple plea. "Come home if you can. We don't care who wins anymore. We just want you to live." He read the letter over and over, the paper trembling in his hands. For the first time in months he wept, not out of shame or grief, but out of exhaustion. The war had taken everything, and yet life still called to him from the ashes. That fragile hope, faint but real, was something even defeat could not destroy. Weeks later, when news of Hitler's death reached the camp, Coke didn't react. Around him some men cheered, others cursed, and a few simply stared into the distance. For Coke, the war had ended long before that day. It had ended the moment he saw the American fuel depot, the moment he realized that all their courage, all their sacrifice had been spent in vain. As spring began to thaw the last of the snow, Coke looked out beyond the camp fences and saw grass pushing up through the frozen earth. It was small, almost invisible, but it was life returning to a world that had nearly destroyed itself. He thought of his wife's letter again, of her words, "Just come home." And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that he might. The war had stripped him of his uniform, his pride, and his illusions. But beneath it all, he was still a man, and in that realization lay a strange kind of victory. Not for Germany, not for the Reich, but for humanity itself. Because even in defeat, even after all the horror and loss, there was still something left worth saving. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Coke closed his eyes and whispered a quiet prayer, not for the war that had been lost, but for the peace that might still come. The firelight flickered across his face, and for the first time in a long time he didn't feel like a soldier. He felt like a survivor,